Hello, everyone. Welcome to another amazing episode of Outside the Studio. I am your host. This is Tessa Tovar. I'm really honored and excited for this conversation today with the author of Heart Medicine, How to Stop Painful Patterns and Find Peace and Freedom at Last by Radhule Weininger. So Radhule is an MD, PhD, a clinical psychologist, psychotherapist, and meditation teacher. She leads meditation groups in Santa Barbara and retreats globally at La Casa de Maria Retreat Center, Spirit Rock, Insight, LA, the Esalen Institute, and the Garrison Institute. We're going to dive into this beautiful book. I'm holding a copy here in my hand if you're watching online. And we're going to talk about the work that she does and just kind of get into it. Welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so honored. Also welcome your sweet little guest, Lucy. If you're watching online, this precious little, what kind of dog is that?
You know, it's her secret. I think there's definitely a bit of Chihuahua in there.
Yeah.
But otherwise I wouldn't know.
It's her secret. I love that. Cool. So let's start off with talking about the book in particular. One of the main and first things that you talk about in this book is the LRPPs, but I think you say it's pronounced lurps, right?
Yeah, lurps.
So can you explain to me what lurps are?
Right. So that little acronym came about from a conversation with my mentor of 20 years, Jack Cornfield, who's also a psychologist and a meditation teacher. And we talked about complexes. You know, in Jungian psychology and Freudian, you talk a lot about complexes. You know, these old wounds, these patterns that often repeat themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And sometimes people feel like sitting ducks, not again, you know, just with a different person.
Yeah.
And so he said, I talked about complexes, and then he said, Radhule, find a new word. And so I played with it, and I think it's maybe a little long, but I came up with long-standing, recurrent, painful patterns, which then became very quickly lurps. And I noticed that my students and clients actually really like the lurps.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, my Shambhala editor too. And, you know, you kind of feel lurped, kind of like slimed, and, you know, it's this sense, what do you call that, an onomatopoeia, where something sounds the way it is.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so lurps is like that. So that's somehow it got stuck there. And it just seemed that neither the purely psychological side nor the purely spiritual mindfulness side really alone had amazing answers on how to free oneself from them.
Yeah.
My own work, which always had been psychological and spiritual, you know, since 1980 really, I felt I needed both. You know, I needed the psychological and the spiritual to free myself at least a little bit. And so that's where the work came from.
Will you tell me what that looks like for you in your practice, in your pathway to healing? What is combining the psychology or the scientific process of healing with the spiritual process of healing?
Mm-hmm. And, you know, I think there's one more. I think psychotherapy is a science and it's an art. It's both of it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
You know, I've been trained as a psychodynamic psychotherapist and also Gestalt and embodied imagination and Jungian and the whole thing, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's family systems and this and that, what has come to us as psychologists. And I also have been a meditator since 1980 when I ended up in a monastery in Sri Lanka. So for me, these two paths kind of went parallel. And, you know, being trained with boundaries and transference, counter-transference, I never meditated with my clients. You know, that was just in the 80s, 90s, not so usual. And then Jack Kornfield asked me, do you meditate with your clients in your office? And I said, oh no, you know, boundaries, transference, counter-transference. And he said, Radhule, get over it. And it's very interesting, you know, so not that I meditate with everybody, but I have now quite a big meditation platform, mindfulheartprograms.org, where we actually every day, probably twice, have meditations. They are free and accessible and everybody can zoom into it. And I noticed that a lot of my clients are using those. And so I think it's an amazing adjunct. And I just notice when people do both, they're in psychotherapy and they also have a spiritual practice, that they got better quicker and also more lastingly.
Yeah.
And so from that observation, I just think we need both. And, you know, I think it depends really on the person, what I might do if I just refer them to the meditation platform. Like recently, I was on a 4-week silent retreat. And one of my clients, I was particularly a little worried, you know, a lot was up for her. And I sure had somebody covering for me. But I asked her in the end, so how did you fare? And she said, actually, I was pretty good because I went every morning to meditation. You know, somebody else was teaching. And so that really helped her. So I thought, that's interesting, you know, that when she really did this, it was okay for me to be gone for a little while. And so I think those two paths really complement each other.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I'm someone who's been, you know, aware of counseling therapy since I was 5 years old, was my first experience in that realm. And also early on with the practice of meditation, or the ritual, I guess I would say, of in my family home, we had an altar where we would sit together and maybe not so much meditation in the traditional sense of like sitting upright, whether silent or guided, but thinking about the practice of spirituality from a ritual standpoint and being intentional with that. So I agree with you 100%. In fact, we were talking about this a little bit before we started to record about, you know, do we value one more than the other? And I think that we would agree that both of these medicines need to come together to heal for each of us. And one is not better than the other, and one is not right or wrong. But they're both tools to have in our tool belt to help us heal and move forward. So with that in mind, I want to talk in particular about trauma, childhood trauma in general. I think it can be a nuanced thing. I think we can experience on a spectrum of something that we might consider obvious trauma, or something a little bit less, like experiencing neglect in childhood, where we can look back at our childhood and say, well, my parents were, you know, I had an intact family. My parents were there for me. I had a roof over my head. I had food in my belly. So what am I complaining about? And I say that in quotes because I do this myself. You know, I had a relatively safe, happy upbringing, but I still have all of these, I call them samskaras, habits and behaviors that I don't think serve me very well in adulthood. And it looks like the result of having childhood trauma. So I want to hear about your definition and that spectrum of childhood trauma that we can experience, whether it's overt or more like internal and a little bit more insidious. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, maybe first I want to say you mentioned the word samskara, which is really the Sanskrit term for those seeds in our mind stream. And I think I talk about that a little bit in heart medicine. How we can look at this from a Western psychology and from a Buddhist/Hindu perspective. And the difference is, I think they're both these knots in our psyche. But in the East, they believe that they may have gone through lifetimes. I was just saying that because you mentioned the word samskara. That's usually part of that understanding. And I'm there fairly agnostic. I don't know, maybe. So I remember the Dalai Lama was once asked, does he believe in nature or nurture? And he gave a really interesting answer. I think that was an interview with Howard Cutler, a psychiatrist. And he said, well, if everything was just nature or nurture, it would be like I lost a key and it can be only under the street lamp because that's the only place I can see. So in a way, there may be many more possibilities where the key could be. So maybe I wanted to say that because I thought that was such a good answer. And in some ways, yes, I have my ideas about childhood trauma and what the new science says. But I think also there's just so much still to learn. And so just now back to childhood trauma, I think there are many different kinds of trauma. There's the childhood trauma where, let's say, a parent died or an accident was witnessed or one of my clients' mom was murdered. So, that terrible things can happen in childhood. And then there's more insidious trauma, as you called it, microtrauma, like a pattern of not being seen or not being understood, or maybe being fed and having a roof over their head, but being brushed off or being ridiculed. So I think those traumas can be cumulative. And I think the jury is really out whether one huge trauma or the cumulative, more subtle trauma is worse. I remember once working, leading an incest survivor group in the late 80s in San Francisco in a big hospital. And people were really traumatized there. And one woman came, she was actually the exception in that group, but she had been raped by a guy in the forest, like a
stranger.
A stranger, somebody maybe just, and so, but her parents were completely appropriate. They took her right to the doctor, they believed her. She was 2 weeks in bed. And I would say she had some harm, but she survived pretty well. While others, where they weren't believed, their mothers didn't want to hear it. There was an ongoing threat of violence or not believing, and just a dysfunctional atmosphere in the house. There was much, much bigger trauma. So it's quite interesting because I see a lot of college students, but I also see many older people. But I live in Santa Barbara, there's UCSB, and so I see a lot of young adults. And so they are just away from their families and often reevaluate. Mm-hmm. And so even the question, is it better if my parents stayed together or got divorced?
Oof, yeah.
Because quite often there are people whose parents stayed together but very unhappily.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the damage can be huge, even though they stayed together for the kids,
Yeah.
While other people who maybe divorced and were civil to each other maybe managed okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And sure, then there are examples where people got divorced and didn't hold it together and were not appropriate or protective. So it's very hard to know. Maybe I didn't answer your question very well. Would you?
No, I agree with you. It is hard to know. And I actually have done a lot of reading on this particular question of what is, if we were going to try to answer the question, what is worse, to experience the overt, obvious, violent, traumatic abuse, or the insidious, where you're not believed, where you're neglected, where you don't have the resources to, learn how to parent yourself, basically, or you don't have the role models that are emotionally mature enough to give you the tools to figure out how to go and then be an adult in the world, because we're all going to experience adversity at some point in time. It's just a matter of when and how do we react to it, I guess, is kind of the way that I think about it. So I don't think I have the answer either, right? But I think
you said something important. You said the way we react to it. So right. I think one thing is, if we have seen our parents react in healthy ways, no matter what the adversity was,
mm-hmm.
that is probably really important. Actually, I might have thought of that, but I don't think it's quite off. That would be an amazing research topic.
Yeah.
It's like seeing your parents react to adversity in appropriate and kind and sensitive ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that, at least in my experience, it may be true for most listeners, maybe not. I'd be curious to hear what everyone's experience is, actually. But I didn't have role models, parental figures in my life who dealt with high stakes emotions. And what I felt was a healthy way. There was a lot of passive aggressive energy. There was a lot of emotional angry outburst that wasn't managed. And anger became this thing that was really scary.
Mm-hmm.
And anger, I believe, is one of those main emotions that we do need. It serves a purpose. It keeps us safe. It tells us when there is danger, but we need to know how to use it, just like we need to know how to use a sharp knife appropriately. And we need to know when to put it away and when to turn it off. So yeah, I don't see a lot of healthy modeling in adults, and certainly in adulthood myself, I don't feel like I have fully come into my powers of using my anger as a tool. Personally, I feel like I'm still dealing with all of my childhood trauma. And so I think what I want to ask you, Radhule, is, so I've heard this before from another psychologist that I work with. I actually came to him and he was aware of my background and my parents. And I had all these questions for him about my childhood and my parents. And I was about in my 30s when I started to ask this question. And he's like, oh, it makes so much sense to me that you're doing this work now in your 30s. This is the time psychologically when we develop and we start to turn our attention inward and really start to heal all of those old childhood traumas.
Mm.
What is your experience with that?
Well, that's interesting. That's almost Jungian. Because Jung said, well, people shouldn't really come to therapy before age 22. Sorry, not 22, 42. kind of the midlife crisis, because that's when we start to look inward. I just think there's much more variety. Like I had to start therapy when I was 22. Mm-hmm. And, I had maybe a little bit more drastic background. My mom, who, survived the Second World War and was quite traumatized there, had me out of wedlock and hid me in an orphanage for 2 years, and then pretended to her family, she was a doctor, that I was adopted. And so there was this big mystery in this family where I came from. They're very Catholic, very repressed. So, that was definitely, it's quite a story. And I definitely had to go to 25 or 30 years of therapy, this and that, to work through that. And in the end, I ended up very well with my mom. She lived here the last years of her life, and she died in my arms. And I'm actually very grateful for that. Mm-hmm. But it took a long time. And I don't know, I'm now meditating 42 years. And, she died 13 years ago. So that would have been maybe around 30 years of meditation. Yeah. But and, definitely had to work with these hurts of abandonment and rejection and shame, a lot of shame. Where does she come from? Something is wrong with her, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so that's probably why I wrote the book, because I felt like a sitting duck to my lurps. Mm-hmm. But, you are right. There are more blatant traumas. And, I had then 2 big car accidents in my early 20s. Mm. The second one left me 6 weeks in the hospital on a brain injury unit. And so I was in medical school then in Germany, and I took some time out and went with my boyfriend to Sri Lanka, whom then I dragged into the monastery. I wanted to go to the beach, but I wanted to go to the monastery.
And you won.
Well, then I went with him to a Hindu monastery in India afterwards, and then we went both back and finished our medical stuff. But it was great, in a way. I had started therapy just a little bit before then, because I couldn't drive the car. Every time I tried to drive the car, my foot would shake. Mm. And my mother, who was not into therapy, said, a doctor has to drive a car. She wanted me to do some cognitive behavioral thing to drive again. Mm-hmm. And I remember my first therapist said, well, the driving will come back by itself, but there are a lot of other things wrong. Mm. And I remember crying, and I was so glad to be there. Mm-hmm. Like therapy wasn't the thing to do then in Germany. So I had to start early. I didn't have the luxury to wait to midlife. And so I would say I might disagree there with Jung, that people start looking inward at all different times. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Some sooner and some later, depending. And then, I think people have also internally different ages. But I don't quite like the old soul. Well, it sounds a bit new agey, but there is something about it. I have one son, I have 3 children, and one of my sons, he is definitely, wow. He was little, and he asked me, Mom, what's behind the nothing and the nothing and the nothing? The other ones were just normal and wanted to party. But yeah. So, so there are individual differences. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I wanted to go back to something that you mentioned more towards the beginning of our conversation. You were starting to talk about LRPs and defining them, and you said something along the lines of these seeds or these habits and behaviors can be, well, I think this was in response to my use of samskara. They can be from this life. Sometimes they can be from past lives, maybe. And I'm curious to know, like in your study and your research and your experience and your thought and your beliefs, what I think the question is like, because I kind of go back and forth with thinking about karma in this way as it relates to samskara. And I don't think of karma in that blatant way of like, you're a bad person, so you're going to get a bad outcome, but more of like thought creates action, creates outcome.
Right.
And how does that... Yeah. Yes. And how does that thread through life cycles and generations and souls?
Yeah.
To create this kind of karmatic soul or exchange. It's a really weird question. I don't even know if I asked a question, but I'm curious if you could speak to that topic a little bit.
This is such an interesting question you are asking. I'm fascinated by it.
Me too.
And again, I have to say that lots of it is for me in the realm of the agnostic. I don't know. I can only guess what makes a human person. I actually asked myself sometimes, not so much why. Well, you could ask different questions with my little story. I asked myself sometimes, why was I so lucky and pulled through? Mm-hmm. This could have ended a lot worse. Mm-hmm. Here I'm quite happily married and have 3 adult children and a dog and a cat, and I'm quite, fulfilled in my life. Mm-hmm. So you wouldn't really expect that. And it seems you're okay if I'm weird, right?
Well, it makes me think about the question of nature versus nurture. Yeah. And then the Dalai Lama's response, or was it Howard Cutler's response?
No, it was the Dalai Lama's response. But
to Howard's question. Yes.
I had this weird experience, but you asked a weird question, so you get a weird answer. But it is... I just came from this 4-week silent retreat, just a week ago, and just really meditating very, very, very deeply. And I got the sense, when I was in that orphanage children's home place, that for some reason I was back there. And then there was this little voice, I was always with you. Mm. So I always had a connection to what the Tibetans call the field of awareness, or awareness as a presence, not as a person, not as a thing, but as something that is both personal and impersonal, that's complete paradox and mystery. And I just had the sense, it was a weird experience, but as you asked, it was there. And so when I met this old monk at age 22 in Sri Lanka, just purely, happenstance, I went down this road, which was called International Buddhist Center. And I was curious. Something pulled me there, and I rang the bell. And this young monk opened, said, "What do you want?" And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "Follow me." Ooh. And then he went and set me in front of this incredibly old little monk, like a mummy. And I thought, wow. And so then he looked at me, and he kind of looked straight through. And so was just this amazing energy. And he said, "What do you want?" And I said, "I don't know. I want to learn." And he said, "Very good. Come every morning at 9:15. And so I did, and then that ended up getting me into the monastery, but I just remember the energy there. It wasn't even what he said, or he didn't say sit straight and do this and do that. It was just, I thought, wow, whatever's going on here, I want. That sense of maybe peace, or I can't quite describe it, so it wasn't really a smart book or even a technique that got me there, even though I did lots of vipassana, insight, mindfulness, Tibetan meditation. But it was really sitting there and sensing there was something really amazing going on here. He died a few weeks later. And I found out he was the head monk of Sri Lanka there. He was a famous guy. Jack Cornfield actually knew him years earlier. But it was just happenstance that I went down that road, that the door opened, that the young monk brought me to him. I was nobody, a young student. I think even in tank top, which you're not supposed to wear in front of a monk. But I didn't know. I had no plan. And so it's interesting.
Yeah, I think so too. And I like weird. I ask weird questions because I like weird responses. Right? I have, there's a couple of threads on that I want to follow. And they're pretty closely related. I think one has to do with the practice of Vipassana and going to a silent retreat. And I think about, preparing for something like that, because I think there are varying lengths that you can sign up for. I don't know what the shortest length of a Vipassana would be, but I've seen like 10 days. And then you mentioned 4 weeks, I think. How do you prepare for some? Because here's my understanding of what Vipassana includes. It's you're not just going and being silent, but you're also disengaging from sensory activities such as reading a book or listening to music. And so it is very much a practice of being silent and drawing the awareness inward. And I think, and tell me what your experience is, that some Vipassana, maybe not all, include things like disengaging from eye contact with other people and even like facial expression, like exchanging smiles and things of that nature. So how do you prepare for something like that? Do you need to practice?
Maybe first I want to say, when I first got there, I was absolutely unprepared. I had not read anything. I didn't know anything. I just, this monk gave us an address and we wrote, and I went there, and I think it was perfect not to know anything, really beginner's mind.
Yeah.
And I just sat and stayed 1 month, 2 months, whatever, until our visa went out. And I just really loved it. I loved sitting. And so since then, I have done, I think usually I go to spirit walk. I think they call that insight meditation. It's very much like you describe it. And I have done, so many of those. The last maybe 5 to 10 years, I got interested in some of the Mahamudra Dzogchen teachings. They come from the Tibetan tradition, and they're a little different in that they are not just, Vipassana gets you to a very deep spiritual state by slowing down or by concentrating. So that's why the not looking, not doing everything very slowly, and then usually you do 10-day retreats, but you can also do longer ones like this 4-week retreat. At day 7 or so, it's almost like spiritual energy breaks through and you get into this subtle mind state. That's how the Tibetans would call it. The Theravadan Buddhists often they have this thing of don't talk about it. Yes, you have this experience, but they don't want to name it.
Yeah.
And I actually, that's maybe why I got, besides having Jack still as my mentor, I got really interested in these Tibetan secret teachings, because there is this idea that awareness is not just a moment by moment awareing, a verb. It's also something that's already there. And that you can kind of touch into and rest into. And actually, you can kind of almost cross over and then be from that perspective. And actually, the Vipassana or insight folks have that too. Actually, had this time long talks, and but they keep it very secretive and for, I don't know, the monks or the teachers. So and I'm also quite interested in social activism. I'm a friend and student of Joanna Macy, and actually a very close friend. She's coming to my morning 7:30 meditations.
Wow.
Which is wonderful. I love her. I really love her. She's 93 now. And this is our world, and it's in trouble. And even though there is something beyond this world, a wider perspective, it's also there. There is a personal and there is a ultimate reality, and we live both. It's a paradox. And so that's why I kind of got interested in these they're called pointing out instructions, these practices where you can actually get to the sense of interconnectedness with the great mystery much faster. Because who can go to a 10-day retreat? They're expensive. And you need to use all your vacation. And, so I'm actually, even though I'm very grateful to all the 10-day retreats I took, I'm not sure this is the only thing I'm advocating these days. And actually I have to say I did during my 4-week retreat with 2 others, one spirit walk teacher and one guy, you might know him, Roger Walsh. He's a great writer in transpersonal psychology and head of a integrative psychiatry program. So we did our Dzogchen practices during these 4 weeks. And so we didn't do really, but they let us do it. They allowed us to do this. And so it was really wonderful. So I think the field is changing because we need practices, and mindfulness is amazing. And it has great psychological benefits to really be aware of yourself and present with the other and all of that. And I think we need to kind of find ways to touch into whatever this field quality of awareness is, and bring it back into our world.
Yeah. I agree with you 100%. I think that's, when we recognize that interconnectedness, I love that word. You brought it up. It reminds us that, I always think back to this. I was coming home from a flight somewhere, and I remember getting off the airplane, and I was headed to the bathroom, and I looked up above the entrance of the bathroom. There was this quote on the wall. And it said, "I am you, he is she, and we are all together."
I love that. Yeah.
I know. It just has stuck with me. And I always think about that in terms of the concept of interconnectedness, not really a concept, but the reality that really that is a true statement. And that we oftentimes forget it because, especially in Western society, we are so wrapped up in what do I have? and what do I not have, and how do I get more of what I want? And there's a lot of I statement in that. And I'm not, pointing any fingers, because this is something that I work on personally for myself. Yeah. So this work, this practice is really important. And as we think about our world being sick, the earth, and the resources that we have, which are finite, that we're kind of burning through, it's important work. So I thank you for that. And thank you for bringing it up. And thank you for writing this beautiful book. And I do want to say, the title again. I said it in the beginning, but I want to call out Heart Medicine: How to Stop Painful Patterns and Find Peace and Freedom at Last. I have so many more questions. I feel like I need a whole another hour with you.
Well, maybe I also want to say that, we have this meditation platform, and I teach almost every morning and many.
Yes. And we'll link to that in the show notes. But will you say you mentioned the URL. Will you say that again for us? mindfulheartprograms.org or Radhule Weininger Ph.D.com. They both link to each other. Great. I'll make sure that definitely
They're
is
free.
The link.
They're completely free, and you can come and go as you want.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much. Yeah. So in the interest of time, this book, so it has so many there's journaling exercises, there's meditation practices in it. There are real life examples. In your experience, you talk about the how-to of all of this, right? So I think the question I want to ask to wrap up our conversation is, what do you hope that readers will take away from this book?
Okay, what I hope readers will take away from this book is first feeling understood and recognized with their lurps, with their old wounds that sometimes recur, and also to know that maybe not with a pill or press of a button, but with some work and some love towards yourself, you can work through this. And you can, get that lurp from the front seat into the passenger, into the back seat, into the trailer, so it doesn't run your life anymore.
Yeah.
And there's hope. And I think the world, the universe, whatever it is, comes towards to help us if we come toward it.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. The world comes toward it as we come to the world, in the way that we were also talking about karmatic exchange and samskara and the seed of thought and the action that follows that. I was just talking with a client before this about the practice of manifestation not necessarily needing to be this magical thing that happens, but a thing that is very practical and requires the conscious mind to say, I have this goal. How do I want to make it happen? I have to actually do something to manifest that reality. So it's not just like this, I want $1 million, poof, I'm manifesting $1 million into my bank account. It is, what are the steps to create that particular outcome? I'm not sure why I just went off on that tangent, but it made me think of that, the practice of manifestation.
Well, actually, there is a beautiful old Chinese proverb that Jack Kornfield often rephrases. And he says, intention leads to behavior. Behaviors make up habits. Habits have something to do with our personality. And personality leads in some ways to our destiny. And I think intention is really important, but I would put one thing in front of intention, which is longing. I think it was Thomas Merton who said, the path to God is not through steps, but through longings. You know, if we really long for this, this reconnection, this home, finding our way home to freedom, then it will lead to an intention.
I love that. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and I think that what I'm taking away from this is that perhaps if you'd welcome a round 2 of a conversation, I would love
Anytime.
that. Because I need more time with you. Well, everyone, that concludes another amazing episode of Outside the Studio. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I hope you learned something new, maybe remembered something old, maybe felt inspired to apply something to your life. You can hear my dog in the background. She's doing a little happy dance. So Daisy enjoyed it. Anyhow, I wanted to just pop in here to wrap us up to say a couple of things. Number one, I have such an amazing team that helps me put these podcasts together. Without them, I wouldn't be able to bring these amazing conversations to you. So thank you to my producer, my director of creative services, my sound editor, my engineer, Consistency Media. Don't know what I would do without you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And the amazing creation and artistic, musical genius, Drew Lovern, thank you so much for putting together this music specifically for Outside the Studio. So unique to the show, only place you're ever going to hear it is right here. Thanks, you guys. You make my world go round. Stay well, everyone. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review, share on the socials, especially if it's a show that you think, hey, this could help somebody else. That's what this is all about, right? We're sharing information so that we're better, so that we're inspired, so that we're lifting each other up, and we're learning how to be in this world, living on this planet to the best of our ability, sharing information and inspiring one another. And that's my hope. That's my hope for the show. Take care.